The changes in the education sector, the way we assess students, the rise of digitalization and artificial intelligence, the changes in the learning environment, and many other unusual and controversial questions. We will be examining them one after the other in this channel. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and this is Education Chatter. Welcome to Education Charter, an independent space that discusses education. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and I'm your host. Today, I'm here with a very special guest calling us from all over from Japan, Mr. Patrick Newell, a man who names himself a catalyst for change, an innovator in education. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation, Patrick.
My absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. I wanted to start maybe, with your personal story before we actually get to, to discussing the future of education, because that's really is the theme of our discussion. I wanted to hear your personal story. How did it happen that you actually ended up in Japan?
That's very interesting. I was not very interested in education. I thought school was a waste of time, and not that I was some kind of intellectual genius by any means. I just didn't see a lot of relevance in it. And I had this dream, the American dream, to become rich. And so I wanted to get involved in real estate. So when I was 18 years old, I got my real estate license. And when I graduated from college, I was a banker in Beverly Hills and living the dream in Malibu on my way to that kind of American dream, but felt empty inside. So I did something which is rare for an American. I actually got a passport and I bought a ticket and I went around the world for a year. And through my travels, I was in Europe, but I also ended up in India and was so amazed by how different India and Asia was that my curiosity was really fed. And then I went to Thailand and was just continued and decided that I wanted to live somewhere in Asia. And this was in 1991. And Japan was the obvious choice because it had deep history, but at the same time, it had everything else, the modern technology, the infrastructure, and so on and so on. So I really wanted to learn much more about Eastern philosophy. And that's why I moved to Tokyo.
All right. And the thing is, the question here is you ended up in Japan, but then, some people say that education is actually a manifestation of a country's culture. Can you say something about this? Because Japanese people are very different from the Europeans, and I'm calling you here from Brussels, so of course I know very little about it. So if you could maybe share this with us.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of dichotomy in some ways. If you think about it, all over the world, no matter which country you're in, the national government, the Ministry of Education, or whatever it's called in different countries, will prescribe a particular curriculum that the students must follow. And Japan happens to be a very disciplined country, and probably a country number one in the world that follows the rules. And so therefore, really, it's a reflection of whatever the Ministry of Education wants people to learn. And so it's really interesting how much power and impact that the Ministry of Education has here. And what's interesting is when you look at like values and how people treat each other, a 6-year-old child will walk to school by themselves with other friends, be greeted at the entrance by other classmates, welcoming them for the school day. They'll take their shoes off, put in their indoor shoes, go into the classroom, and then everybody will stand up and bow and start the lesson. And then they'll finish the lesson with a bow as well. And then when lunchtime comes, classmates bring the lunches of other students into the class. And at the end of the school day, the children will clean the school and then go home. And this is the kind of the hidden curriculum in some ways, right? And the way that
collective culture, isn't it?
Collective culture, collective intelligence. It's a collective society, as And so it's very much a collective society. And so it's really about aligning and having harmony, and being harmonious. Where I was raised in California and many other countries and places, it's about being unique. It's about being the individual. It's about your rights. And Japan and some other Asian countries, it's quite different. It's really about the we versus the me. And you know, reading and writing in Japanese is extremely difficult. You know, for example, in the English language, right, we have 26 letters and you know, A to Z. Well, Japan, there's 52 hiragana, 52 katakana, and about 1,000 of the Chinese characters, or 1,500 if you just want to get through primary school.
Wow, that's impressive. That's really impressive. Forgive my ignorance. But you know, you wrote a number of books about, you know, future of education. You're a renowned speaker, international speaker about you know, the future, the way the society will look like in the future, and how can education contribute to it. Why do you think we need a school then? Is a school, you know, because some people say school is actually a 19th century invention. And it's no longer corresponds to, you know, to the very needs of our society. And you yourself, you just mentioned you didn't enjoy the school very much, and maybe you can also share why wasn't the case.
Well, I'll give you an example. Last week, so Japan in 2025 will have what the Osaka Expo. And I'm in a think tank to create the environment and the pavilion for the expo. Right. And the pavilion that I'm in is led by one of the leading Android makers in the world, Ishiguro. Mm-hmm. And he said, okay, we're going to create this pavilion to share the world in 2075. It'll be 50 years after the expo, right? And the area that one of the areas they've asked me to interact in is around learning. What is learning going to look like in 2075? Right? And all these people they're thinking technology kind of thing. And I said, I think it's going to be completely the opposite. And there's this kind of mindset that technology really is going to lead and drive learning and the future of learning. But when you really look at it, it's a tool. Right. It's a tool to support us and enable us, hopefully, to be able to learn more in a more effortless and hopefully a more human way. So I had this whole group of Japanese people, and we're sitting there, and they're like, oh, yes, the leading androidist in the world, Ishiguro, is going to have 10 androids in the room, and we're going to do this with technology and that with technology, and it's going to be this. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow. If you look at the World Economic Forum, the Future Skills, you look at McKinsey, the EU as well, and it's this hybrid of this understanding technology, being able to engage and work with it. You know, ChatGPT is an excellent example, right? Mm-hmm. How can you really leverage the power of ChatGPT to enable you to learn different things? And so my answer was, I think in 2075, what's going to be interesting is two things. One is going to be telepathy. How can we develop the highest level of telepathy? And the other is maybe our spiritual understanding, or our ability to be present and understand and regulate ourselves to be more human positive.
Very interesting and surprising, isn't it? I must say, I agree with you. It's been, you know, I've been working in this sector for the last 15 years or so, both as a teacher and a kind of a policy shaper, let's call it this way, a representative of all kinds of organizations in the field of education. And it's true that we actually discussed this, you know, digitalization and the learning of the future, as you say it, as a kind of a new realm full of toys and all kinds of devices and big data and so on. And on the other hand, yeah, I meet you, you tell me, well, I think it will be quite the opposite. Now, so what will happen to the school then if indeed this future that you just have portrayed to us would be realized?
Well, let me finish that thought, if I may, Daniel.
Mhm.
So I spent probably close to 2 years studying very carefully the concept of digital twins.
Mhm.
Right? And there's a lot of different versions of digital twins, but I was looking at it very carefully in the context of the neurocortex, our human brain, and our non-neural cortex, or our digital brain. And if you think about it, right now we have the cloud, and we have tons of things that we've created and put in the cloud. And more, we're utilizing the cloud to coexist with our human brain. And you could look at that even with this, the smartphone, the technology we have. And then you look at the cloud and you say, if we start to synthesize how the brain works together with the cloud, and we start to find the harmony, then it really gets interesting. And this is where the Android conversation got interesting. So what I was saying, okay, we have 10 Androids in a room, and a group of humans walk in. Where is that collective intelligence? How do we bring those two together? And so my suggestion was that the Android becomes the kind of the facilitator, the bearer of knowledge, and maybe the answer to a lot of the questions. And to what level it'll be as we move forward, it'll be quite interesting. And it's in some ways, it's like the Android version of a ChatGPT, but so many levels further. And this comes kind of aligns around the concept of singularity. When machine intelligence and human intelligence equals each other, then what does that look like? What do we need to learn? Why do we learn? And how must we learn? And it's not really about technology versus humanity. It then comes down to how can we have technology allow us to be more human, or have a higher level of creative collective intelligence to find harmony with our planet, with nature, and each other. And there's a lot of studies in the world that say the most important thing to longevity and health is relationships.
Right.
Right. So when you think about school, why do we go to school?
Well,
and as things are evolving, is that front loading the certain amount of knowledge that's necessary for allow us to connect the unconnected? And when you get into the topic, say around creativity or innovation of the future, it's let's just say, how do you wire the brain for the future? And my answer has been, you wire the brain for the future by creating it. And so when you make something, it doesn't exist. When you make something, you're looking into the future and you're visualizing something. And then you're taking all your existing knowledge and you're aggregating that to then create, to bridge that vision with your knowledge and whatever materials and resources you have to make that come true. And your process of your brain continues to do that. And if you make and create enough, then you are prepared to create the future and you're ready for the future. If you can do that with other people, collaboratively together with technology, you can really have a high level of creative collective intelligence. And when we make and create things, we're generally happy unless somebody tells us it's not good or it's crap. We usually feel like, oh, we made this and this was our version of whatever. It's a very powerful experience.
Right. You see, it's indeed true that I think COVID-19 has actually showed us this, that schools are not just there to kind of pass on knowledge. They are really there to help us grow also in this humane way. And the moment that we were forced just to move our actual class into a virtual realm, it all kind of started shrinking. Do you have any lessons learned from COVID-19? What do you think was useful about this? Can we actually benefit from this new approach? And what could be the shortcomings of it? What could be the problems that emerge?
What's interesting is, you have a group of whatever age. It doesn't matter whether it's 3-year-olds or 23-year-olds. In our existing education system, we're putting them all in one room. And often we're expecting them to learn the same thing at the same time from a teacher, somebody that's bearing a certain level of wisdom or expertise. But when else in our life do we put together a group of, it doesn't matter, 12, 13, 14-year-olds and say, you're all going to learn the same thing at the same time because this is what the government thinks you should learn? It's bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely bizarre.
All right. But then what's, if this is, we're talking about the, old-fashioned way of educating, because in fact, one thing that we discovered also over the time of COVID was that education was valued by parents, not only because it sort of course, helps the development of their children, but most importantly, or quite importantly, it was because it was a place where they can put them, and it was
yes.
about the care, because otherwise they could not really start working. They were forced sort of to start looking for flexible arrangements in their workplace. So that's another thing that we also saw in COVID-19 during COVID-19. But I also wanted to if you just describe the role of what a school would be, what would be the role of a teacher then? Okay. You say that there would be, we're gonna have androids and in the classroom and so on, but what would be the role of the teacher then? How would it change with the, you say that today we have those teachers that stand in front of the classroom and they are supposed to have a certain level of wisdom and they teach. And now, what would be the change for the teacher profession then?
So if you think about it, and I know within your organization, you have some national level organizations that are prescribing what should be taught and learned within a school environment, right? And I don't think that's going to change. I think the ministers of education around the world are going to continue, the governments are going to continue to want to prescribe what they think should be taught and learned within those classrooms. Now, how they learn, and to some degree at what pace they learn the various subjects, I think it's going to be really beautiful utilizing technology. And what's interesting is if you have a teacher standing in front of the students versus, let's say, a master teacher that's been pre-recorded, and each student goes at their own pace at each subject for a certain percentage of the curriculum, then that environment where you have these 20 human beings together becomes an amazing opportunity to develop the social intelligences and the emotional intelligence and the concept of self-awareness and self-compassion, self-regulation, and then there's a social and there's a systems thinking. And so there's layers that can start being addressed here. And then if you have students actively learning, creating, making, doing things together, then the teacher really shifts much more to a guide or facilitator that sets up the framework, shares what excellence looks like, and steps aside and gets out of the student's way, really. And then monitors using the learning management system, whatever technology, the progress of the students according to whatever that government is prescribing for them to learn. And we all know, a lot of students go to school so that they can go to another school, so they can go to school, so they can go to college, and so therefore they can get a job, right? And that's been the kind of driving force of schools. But I've been really involved in the last couple of years, looking very careful at social and emotional and behavioral skills. And I think that's really going to be the role of the humans, is to say, how can we have the highest level of social, emotional, behavioral skills? And together, it's been a real pleasure and honor to be part of OECD in a pilot program, which is a survey for measuring social and emotional skills. And there's this saying that, where attention goes, energy flows. And right now, we're not putting really any much metrics or measurement on the development of the human. When you look at Davos, and like I said, or McKinsey, and they have technology as the number one, and number two is social, emotional, and the soft skills. However, we're not measuring them. We're allocating time for that really within the learning environments. It's quite unbalanced if you think about it and look at moving forward.
So if I understand correctly, the teachers will be those that somehow will be responsible for this emotional, social, and behavioral development of children, whereas knowledge could be somehow passed on through digital means. Is that what you're trying to
Yeah, it's a balance. It's a balance because it's important to have a certain basis of your own knowledge. But it's like, what was it the other day? We were having a conversation around what were the safest country in the world or something along those lines, right? And and I said, let's ask Dr. Google, right? And sure enough, boom, within a few seconds, you had that, right? So it's an interesting balance and moving forward to think about that. And what's really fascinating is the number of teacher shortage around the world and teachers who are being burnt out. In Japan, they're overworked. I think they just started striking in Korea, and they're underpaid and undervalued. And what's fascinating for me is that there's very little training for teachers to develop these social, emotional, behavior skills themselves. And what's been fascinating to me is if we said to a group of teachers, we are going to do a teacher training program that's going to develop your social, emotional, behavioral skills, they probably wouldn't be nearly as interested, and this is the nature of teachers, as if you said, we're going to provide some programs that's going to really help you prepare your children for the future because they need these social, emotional, behavioral skills. And we have them engage in these programs of how they can enhance the learning environment, enhance the learning, or maybe even increase their academic success by 10 to 20% through developing these skills. But what we're doing is we're developing programs that are for the students, for the teacher training, but probably 80% of the program will be focused on the teachers developing their own skills around resilience and developing these skills themselves, so they can therefore have the empathy or understanding to be able to then pass that on to the particular age group that they're working with. So teacher well-being is huge, and the amount of professional development around that and the focus on that is also really low. I think there's a huge gap right now around what's being called SEL, social emotional learning, around the world. And that movement is starting to really happen now, is where governments are saying, look, people are unhappy, people are committing suicide, a lot of things happening in the workplace. We need to reskill. And these social emotional behavioral skills, I think, are one of the key things moving forward. So how can these teachers become better coaches? But they themselves need to embrace this. Right. And it's the same with parents.
Right. Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because in many countries we see that we have a very aging teachers population. We have a significant challenge in many countries, at least I don't know if it is a worldwide phenomenon, but certainly in Europe, we have countries in which in 10 years there will be no young teachers. We have countries like Portugal where you have majority of teachers are actually heading towards 60 years old and more. And because of that reason, we deal with certain problems with teacher shortages, in particular science-related topics and subjects. But yeah, your vision of education, where teachers are responsible primarily for emotional and social development of the children, could somehow this transformation of the profession could somehow address this challenge. What are your thoughts about this then, about the shortage of teachers?
Yeah, what's interesting is a lot of it depends on the country. It depends on the scenario. In some countries, being a teacher is not necessarily an honorable profession. It's a default because you couldn't do something else, or you were not successful in a particular area, right? So that's one scenario. There's a lot of scientists. It's really fascinating for me when I work with PhDs and scientists and different people, how low their social, emotional, and behavioral intelligence are, because they kind of got in their labs and their little worlds. And so for a scientist or somebody, say, with a mathematical or a science background, then to shift into becoming a teacher, there needs to be enough of incentive for that to happen. And they need to feel encouraged that they will be able to, if their passion is science or mathematics, or that they'll be able to really share that passion and ignite that passion within their learners. And I wonder if that's the case in the existing infrastructure or structure, whether that's around the amount that they're being paid or how they're being honored. What's interesting in Singapore, and I'm sure there's probably some Northern European countries as well, where if you're a teacher, that's a really honorable thing. Japan, if you're a teacher, it's a pretty honorable thing. What's been shifting is that there's a lot of teachers leaving the profession because it's just way too much they have to do. In Japan, for example, and other Asian countries, teachers really don't even get a summer break.
Right. Right. Interesting. Yeah, very good. Yeah, but at the same time, I am a teacher myself, and why do I teach? I teach because I love the learning process. I love the learning process of the students, and I love the learning process of myself while teaching. And some people say it's a vocation and so on, but at the same time, I mean, there's plenty of people that, self-development, personal development, this kind of approach to constant learning or continuous learning is central in their lives. And yet this kind of people avoid the profession. Why is that so? Is it because it is too centralized? Is it because there's too little space for flexibility? What would be your take on this?
And I think you just hit it right on the nose, Daniel. Are we developing lifelong learners?
Right.
Is the matrix upon which we're measuring success aligned with lifelong learning? I met this guy yesterday that just started his own school, and he's an entrepreneur. And it was a pretty kind of radical high school that he started. And I said, have you really reflected upon the depth of the skills that are necessary to be an entrepreneur? They hit on so many different facets. And also, I think in some ways, Daniel, we've, the other thing I think is fascinating is in the world outside of education. Do you stop and say, oh, I'm doing science now? Right? Or I'm doing drama or whatever. I mean, in life, it's really about integration versus segregation. And so I think it's really fascinating that we're still segregating things as much as we are, and then grading on that versus the integration and active learning, and really looking at project-based learning and saying, okay, here's the output of the learning that took place, and digitalizing that and sharing that as a portfolio of their ability to complete things and do things, and level of intelligence and perseverance and all these other things. And that's why I'm really fascinated with the concept of digital portfolios, and actually digital portfolios from a young age going through their life. And so you very quickly know who that person is and what they're capable of doing. And imagine at a company, if you said, okay, somebody's done all the different social, emotional, behavioral assessments. They know who they are as a human. They've created all this content, and here's who they really are. What would you hire them for? Or what program should they enter in a learning environment? Would be quite clear versus our existing kind of metrics.
I'm quite intrigued by your comment about integration. I assume that what you mean here is the integration of the education sector within a wider labor market. So if I understand it correctly, I would imagine having, let's say, teachers or people that work somewhere. They have their own projects, their own companies, and so on, and yet they contribute by, I don't know, providing certain teaching in the school context. Is that what you mean by integrating it with the wider community?
I mean, if you think about, I just put it this way, in a very simple way, Daniel, we used to think it was the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, right? And we know that's not the case. We know that it's the left and the right firing back and forth all the time, right? So to think that a particular subject area should be isolated in depth for a long time when that's not the reality of how the world works. I look at it as collective intelligence, right? It's the many pieces together that makes the whole. To what level do we need to focus on the pieces in order to understand the whole? And it also fascinates me sometimes when you think about, like, here's a question I'd like to ask you or even the audience is, if you were to, it's input output, right? And the brain, right? So what are the 8 processes that we should wire the brain to fully understand so that we will be able to work through almost any scenario that's put through to us? And today I was working with this multi-billion-dollar corporation, and we're looking at how to develop a global strategy. And they were asking me, how do we develop a global communication strategy? And how do we share that messaging? And then to me, it was just like, okay, which process are we going to use to navigate us through where we want to reach? Yeah. And so for me, it's really, is that the inquiry process or the research process? Is the process of being able to tell a story? Is it the process of being able to, look at things critically? Is it the process of being able to develop good questions? Is it, what are those processes? And there's a ton of them that we should be, it's hardwiring our brain and creating those very strong neural paths in those processes. And it's like, okay, here's a scenario, here's a process I need. And you just go through those steps, and and then you come to the end. And then hopefully before you get there, say, what would excellence look like? What would be an amazing outcome that we would like to see? And then you go through that process. Right. If that makes sense.
Right. Okay. Well, you see, in my view on this is that, the most important skill that the school teaches you is the ability to teach yourself. And the fact that you can actually, face any kind of challenge that is in front of you, that you're a mature person enough, that you have a certain value system. And value system, I'm not talking here about, let's say, religiously based values, but rather things like discipline, like resilience, like and of course these are the main themes that I'm a parent myself. If I would could name a number of things that I would like my children to be taught, are those things. Because of course the future is unknown, and yet there are certain things that are timeless, that they are useful and useful throughout history, and no matter what kind of circumstances you will find yourself in, you will be benefiting from having those skills. But anyway, I wanted to talk also a little bit about what makes you optimistic then about the future? What are maybe first, what does the schools do bad according to what you think, and what makes you optimistic about the future then? Is there something that you can look into the future with certain hope about the future of learning?
There's a couple different ways I could answer that question. Probably one of the most powerful is mindset, right? Your mindset, one of my favorite quotes is, if you think you can do something, or if you think you can't do something, you are absolutely right. And if you're also projecting into the future, and so this was interesting around the 2075 conversation I was having around the expo, was, what future do we want to project? Do we want to get into a dark Black Mirror kind of scenario where, you know, there's a lot of ethical things that are happening and the world's getting really funky and it's dark and heavy? Or do we want that light, bright, you know, beautiful utopia-like scenario? And you watch these, you know, these things around climate change and the, 2% increase in the temperature, and we can't go outside and all of that. How's that serving anybody? It might wake us up to shift our behavior, possibly through fear motivation. Or the other opportunity is to say, hey, let's choose to be human positive. Let's choose to look at things in that way. And this is where the social emotional behavioral skills become really interesting. You start to self-regulate yourself, or you stop yourself from going down that path of negativity or abusing yourself or lacking self-compassion or viewing the world in such a way. It's really easy to be negative. Mm-hmm. The challenge often is how to look at something in a positive way. And that comes down to hardwiring and how you wire your brain and the mantras that you have and the messages that you share, or how you choose to look at that future that does not exist.
Right. Very good. Last question, really. Thanks a lot for all your time. But last question here. Of course, you were involved in founding the Tokyo International School. And this is also a question for our viewers. Maybe you can share with us in the chat. What is the main changes that are taking place right now? So if we discussed a little bit the future in 2070s, but what's the main changes that are actually taking place in the schools right now? And this is also apart from the question for you, is also for our viewers. Please share with us, tell us what you think about this. What is it that in your very school it's changing? What is different? If you're a teacher or you're a parent or you're just a student also, you can share with us and tell us what is different in comparison to the past. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a great question. So there's a couple things happening. One is that the world outside of learning continues to ask for a certain kind of human being to navigate through this future. And are we really, is the output of our education system really aligning with that or not? We're being challenged with a variety of things. One of them is COVID. That was one that really, really made us sit back. And for those who were not digital or not embracing the potential of technology, there was no choice. Now, whenever you stretch a rubber band, it never goes back to the same place. So to what degree has that COVID band come back or not? And this is not just in the learning environments, this is in the work environments. And I've been studying this very carefully as well. And each country's had a different reaction to this. The next one, which I'm really excited about. So I was like, of course, not about the depths and everything that happened with people, but I was like, wow, there's finally something that is going to just rock the world of education and have to really shake it. And we find this harmony with technology, right? And obviously it was on the other side of the spectrum, but the rubber band hopefully doesn't go back to where it started. The second one I'm really excited about is AI and ChatGPT and all these, because a lot of universities right now, or even let's say college essays, there's a big debate around having ChatGPT write the essays or not. Or in my university where I teach MBA, it's like, in your course, where do you think it would be most logical to let students use AI to balance that out? And then somebody was like, well, if they have ChatGPT, I'm not going to be able to teach them anything. And I'm like, well, maybe you don't have a class anymore. Maybe you don't have a course anymore, or you need to shift. And this is answering one of your questions earlier, how you create lifelong learners. Or the other is, which we often don't do, and this is what this technology is making us do, is asking the right questions, creating the right prompts, putting in the narratives that will then allow for us to have that proper conversation with technology to figure out the answers to the questions we have to enhance and enable our curiosity.
It all comes down to, how can we actually use the new tools without, compromising the entire assessment structure and so on. And actually, how can we really, as you said, how can we really make sure that we can be simultaneously using what's in front of us and implement it and integrate it to the school context, and whether and to what extent it's useful. I remember, I am coming from Poland, and I remember in 1990s in our quite conservative schools, we were actually discussing whether we should be using calculators, or we should be just learning to calculate ourselves with our pencils. And I remember teachers being opposing to it, and from quite significant time in the school context, I was not using calculators. I think I started using it in high schools, and it was just like the finals of the high school. So I was almost like 18 years old. So it wasn't that long time ago. But now we have the same challenge with Chat GPT and AI, and the question of whether it is useful, to what extent it's useful, and where to use it. But of course, all this is quite exciting, is very exciting, and we're going to follow this up within our program, within the Education Charter. Patrick, I wanted to thank you for your time. It was really greatly enriching. Thanks a lot for this. I wanted to thank our viewers as well for listening to us, for watching this video, and please stay with us. Comment. We asked you a question about the changes that happen in your school. I'm looking forward to all those discussions that we will have on our chat, and follow and subscribe our channel and Education Charter. Thanks a lot, and stay tuned.